Hi, Misha here, and I did that 12-part series on Russian jet aircraft, mostly fighters, fighter bombers, interceptors, and I thought I was pretty much done. Did one on the MiG-25 here, and then like a week later, I picked this model up, or rather found it at Pete's Collectibles. And no, I didn't pay the sticker price. He kind of cut me a pretty good deal. This is the very first release from Hobbymaster, 1/72 scale diecast. These are MiG-25 PD. Well, one's a PD, one's a PDS. One is Iraqi, one is Libyan. The only original MiG-25P that Hobbymaster has done to date is this one. Lieutenant Viktor Balinko. His aircraft that was flown to Japan in 1976 and kind of changed the game in many, many ways. So I thought we'd do a little update video, throw in some more little factoids about the MiG-25, and look at the differences between the 25P and 25PD, and even 25PDS for what it's worth while we're at it. Because each of these three aircraft really does represent kind of a famous moment in the so-called Foxbat, that was the NATO reporting name's history. This would have been the Foxbat A, and these would be Foxbat E's. The Foxbat B was the MiG-25R, and the Foxbat C was the MiG-25 UB, or the two-seat version. Anyway, well, let's get into it. And again, if you haven't seen my original video, check that out for more details, because this is kind of an update, so it won't be full anything. I do want to give another shout out to Pete's Collectibles down in Houston for hooking me up with this one. This model is long out of print. Will Hobbymaster ever do another MiG-25P? I don't know. They did announce another MiG-25 for 2022, but it's a PD. So they may not. They may have altered the tooling. And in just a minute, we will talk about some of the key external differences, and of course the internals when they went to the PD. But these are getting quite pricey, as most out-of-print models are. So he did not have to hook me up with this as a frequent customer, but he did. It's still what it was, quite a bit of coin, so I held off on picking it up until I had a good sales weekend, which was Labor Day. And at first it probably does look like a regular Foxbat. It's 65 feet long, 46-foot wingspan. These giant Tumansky engines. Originally the 25. Well, the whole idea of this was designed for speed and altitude. Not really maneuvering, definitely not dogfighting. And they achieved that. The first 25R prototype flew at the beginning of 1964, and the first 25P Interceptor prototype flew later in September of that year. The 25R reconnaissance version was for the VVS, and the 25P was for the Air Self-Defense Forces, the PVO. Now, the 25R was only produced for a very brief time before it was replaced on the production line by the 25RB, which was still a reconnaissance aircraft, but it also was a bomber that dropped 500-kilogram bombs. Originally, it only carried 4. Later versions could carry up to 10 with multiple racks. It was kind of an interesting system, too, because the computer on board would essentially tell the pilot when to press the button to drop the bombs. It would even fly him to the correct position and everything All he had to do was press the button. And it was actually the 25R that first saw service. It was accepted into service in '69, although it would take a couple of years to really work the kinks out. And it was actually some very late pre-production models that were sent to Egypt in 1971, and they would overfly Israel. They would go home, but then come back in '73 for the Yom Kippur War, and again would annoy the crap out of the Israelis. They would fly high and fast, and were able to really outdo anything the Israelis had, which this kind of preview in the Middle Eastern conflicts. Now, these planes are always flown by Russians, but of course they denied it. They really worried the West. The West had been concerned about the MiG-25 for a long time. They didn't know what it could and couldn't do. And even though the reconnaissance version was first into service, the air defense version, the Interceptor version, was first accepted in 1971 and started to enter into service in 1973. Although it would take a little time because they ended up having undiagnosed crashes, which were killing pilots early on. Turns out part of the rudder system, flap system in the back here was sticking, and it was very specific circumstances, very kinky bug, but they finally worked that out, which allowed them to really start putting these into full production and use by the mid-70s. And it was a pretty impressive aircraft. The two engines could get it up to, well, cruise speed was about Mach 2.3. Maximum safe speed was about Mach 2.8. And it could get up to Mach 3.2. But this would usually do irreparable damage to the engines. But in a pinch, if it was that or get caught, hey, it was something to do. It had 4 missiles, R-40 missiles. These are giant missiles. They're about 6 meters long each, nearly 500 kilograms. They were meant for shooting down bombers. And typically a warlord would have 2 heat seekers and 2 radar guided. Now, this was a one-seater in the Interceptor version. They considered having a backseater to be a weapons officer, much like you'd see in more of an American aircraft, but instead it was controlled from the ground, which was a system the Russians typically went for. Now, this was an interesting airframe, but it had a relatively short range, although it could go pretty far based on just the speed, but its endurance was not great. Those 2 engines, as you would imagine, burned fuel like no one's business. Now, this whole fuselage and wing, it was essentially a fuel tank. As much as 70% of the interior was for fuel, and because of the high speed and high altitude, they had to go with stainless steel. They used a little bit of aluminum alloy and a little bit of titanium, but mostly stainless steel. And because of this, this wasn't riveted together. It was actually arc welded, which started a pretty advanced process for its day and time. So that's why you don't see drop tanks on these. You had only the 2 hard points under each wing, the 2 giant engines, the single seat cockpit. Now the cockpit was pretty conventional. Analog gauges and controls. And this used, quite famously as we know, vacuum tubes. Now it had the very interesting and very powerful Smersh A1 radar system, although later this was updated to A2 and A3. It was a dual band system that could basically not be jammed or could punch through any jamming, and it was good from as high as 27,000 meters to as low as 500 meters detection, and it could really detect out to about 60 kilometers and actually track and actively do that 30 to 35 kilometers. It wasn't especially advanced, it was just powerful in the nose. And the whole point of this, when it was designed, Russia was worried about high-speed, high-altitude bombers, the B-58, which went into use, and the B-70, the Valkyrie, which never did. They were also worried about reconnaissance flights, originally the U-2, but more importantly, the SR-71 Blackbird, which is really the only other serial-produced military aircraft that could rival this for speed and altitude. So the idea, this would zoom up, it would receive control and assistance from ground stations, it would intercept these high-flying aircraft and launch missiles at it. And it had to be done very quickly because the closing speeds were very high. Unfortunately for the MiG-25, in the 1960s, combat changed. From fast and high, they went low and slow. And one might think this would leave the aircraft without, much in the way. But then, Viktor, Balinko. On September 6, 1976, Lieutenant Viktor Belenko of the Soviet People's Air Defense Force, he took off from a nearby airbase located by Vladivostok on a routine training flight. During the flight, he dove low, turned off his radio and other equipment, and actually at first the Soviets thought he crashed. They didn't know what happened. But his plan was to fly to Japan, and he did. He just barely reached a civilian airport, though. He had less than a minute worth of fuel left, and he came in narrowly missing a passenger aircraft, doing some damage to the airfield and also a little bit to his front landing gear. But all in all, he was able to successfully land the MiG-25P. And since really only they'd started fully equipping the Russian military in the last couple of years, his aircraft was brand new with the latest version of the Smersh radar set, the latest R-40 missiles, so on and so forth. So it was after all the bugs had been worked out. And this again was an aircraft that the West was concerned about in a major way. It had very little data on. And in fact, as you know, the F-15 was kind of designed around what they thought the MiG-25 Foxbat could do. So they got it, and this is where things get interesting. It lands in Japan. Now, you hear about Japanese firearms laws. What's one of the first things they do? Well, the Japanese arrest Lieutenant Balinko for possession of an unlawful firearm. In other words, his sidearm. Yeah, they take it seriously. They also were rather unhappy about his damage they did to the airport. But of course, America stepped in, and this was little of nothing, and charges would ultimately be dropped. And he would be interrogated, but softly. He asked for asylum and would be soon granted. Russia initially asked for him to be handed back along with his aircraft. He would not be handed back because he would have been shot as a traitor, or at least imprisoned for a very long time. But they did eventually have to give back the aircraft. At first, the Japanese were very reluctant to let their American allies do much more than look at it, but soon realizing that their own self-defense was kind of dependent on American technology. They recently started flying the F-4 Phantom, for example. They let Americans get a little more handsy. In fact, they took it apart. They even tried running up the engines, playing with the radar, so on and so forth. And when Russia first tried to send over a military plane, cargo plane, to take it back, the Japanese refused. Instead, they insisted that Belenko's MiG-25P be loaded on board a Soviet boat, and then it was taken back to the motherland. They found themselves with 30 some sources say 40 crates of parts. Yeah, the whole thing had been taken apart. It had been scribbled on. Yeah, it's one of those things like when you loan your friend your Xbox, and if they return it in a big bag full of parts with magic marker, that's pretty much what they did with the Foxbat. And Russia said, hey, several components and subassemblies are missing. You owe us $10 million. Japan's response was, your guy damaged our airport. You owe us $40,000. Something tells me neither side probably ever paid the bill. But it's kind of like how Britain always sends America a bill for the tea from the Boston Tea Party. One of those things. So what did America learn? Well, it really showed them what the MiG-25 was and wasn't. But it also would help Russia out. They realized that the radar set was old vacuum tube technology. Now, yeah, it had some benefits. It was resistant to heat and cold. It was pretty much impervious to EMP. It was known stable technology, but it was also old technology and limited. Plus, it did not have look-down, shoot-down capability, and they realized they could simply fly under 500 meters and avoid it. They also found some limitations with the missiles, and they noticed the limitations with the engines and speed and all that. See, they had observed a MiG going at Mach 3.2 during all the events around Israel early on. So they thought they could just achieve this at will. Afterwards, they realized that, they couldn't really do that all the time. It was kind of a last-ditch measure, if you will. So really the fear was off. But by this time, the F-15 was already entering service. So they had overdone themselves. And this aircraft, they discovered, it was extremely fast. It had a very good altitude. But it was limited, and it maneuvered for shit. It was not a fighter. At first, that's what they thought it was, a true fighter. It's not. It is a true interceptor. Of course, the reconnaissance version and the bomber version were, a little different. But, yeah. Now, at this time, Russia was working on the MiG-25P, an updated, modernized version. And they were also working on the MiG-31, at least what would become the MiG-31 Foxhound. But with all the, let's just say with the cat being out of the bag with Belenko's aircraft in their hands, they had to change their plans rather dramatically, and this really worked out for the best. The MiG-25PD, Foxbat E, PD standing for Updated or Upgraded Interceptor. The MiG-25MP was scrapped. And actually, even before Belenko's aircraft was returned, around November 4th, the powers that be in Russia ordered that this updated version be created. And central to it was a new radar system. Known as the Sapphire, this was derived from that recently tried out and used on the MiG-23, although of course bigger and better. It could detect slightly further out, but more importantly, it could detect further down, as low as 50 meters, effectively being look down, shoot down, and even a little bit higher, up to about 30,000 meters, meaning that it could almost even go at the SR-71 Blackbird and pretty much any other fighters around. So increased up and down. This new radar set was actually semiconductor based instead of vacuum tube, so a more modern system. And to go along with it, they would have updated versions of the R-40 missiles in both heat-seeking and radar-guided. They would also add a new infrared sensor system. You can see the little housing here. was good because instead of painting a target with the radar, which would let them know they were coming, the infrared system was much more passive. So even though I had shorter range and some other things, it was quieter. So not a bad option if needed. And it could still carry the 4 R40s, but alternatively it could carry 2 R40s and 4 R60s, a new lightweight short-range air defense missile, 2 on each wing. That was good because the original 25P had no self-defense. Its 4 missiles were for offense. It had no cannon. Now it actually has something to defend itself. Still not a fighter, but at least it gives something. And remember how I said it had limited range and endurance, even though it does carry a lot of fuel. This was the version that introduced this giant fuel tank that I mentioned in the first video. Now you think this would give this exceedingly great range, but remember, much of the aircraft is still wet, so really this didn't add as much fuel as you would think. Well, it does add a lot of fuel, it's just the engines are just that thirsty. And of course itself adds weight and drag, so it's kind of diminishing returns. This just doesn't add as much. This was much more common on the 25RB version, where it made a little more sense. It was rarely, if ever, seen on the 25PD. But it was optional on the center line, whereas with the original 25P, that center point does not seem to have been plumbed for a tank. At least, best guess. They would make a few other structural changes, systems updates, really just modernizing the design. They would also update the air intakes for the engines. They would go to an updated version of the engines, a little more efficient. Update the communications, update the front info systems, of course, after the compromise of Belenko's. And, mostly, it was the new radar set that would be the big deal. In 1978, so just 2 years, the new version was ordered into production, and it would quickly kind of come around about 1979 and start popping in. Now, one other benefit, up until 1976, Russia was not keen to sell the MiG-25 even to its allied nations. Now, this was considered cutting-edge technology. But after this exposure of what they had, then they were much more willing to sell. That's why we have these foreign models here. Of course, there is the final variant to talk about real quick. Even though I mentioned it before, why not? I'm a completionist. The MiG-25 PDS. PDS stands for Upgraded Interceptor, either in service or in field, if you want to be more correct. These were upgraded Ps to PD standard. Now, they would build just under 1,200 Foxbats. And of these, only 150 were brand new build 25 PDs. The majority were actually PDSs. And of course, you still have RBs and a few other models like the 2-seaters too. Now, one thing that's a little interesting that sources seem to disagree on. Could the PDS carry the centerline fuel tank? It's hard enough to find pictures of any of these having the fuel tank. Some say because they were upgraded Ps that they could not. Others say that they could. If anyone knows, that would be great. But otherwise, the PDS is the same bird. It even has the infrared sensor under the nose and the other updates. In fact, at this point, let's compare the two models because there are several small but interesting differences. So looking at the nose, it is slightly enlarged for the PD-PDS. Not so much elongated as just reshaped for more internal volume. That's for the new Sapphire radar set. And like I said too, under it, the original version does not have the boxy infrared sensor, and the updated version does. The engine intakes are ever so slightly different too. Notice the little kind of flare here. Little differences. And the wing tips have different shaped pods on them. The PD-PDS is a little bigger. These are a little more roundy. These are a little more straight. Just different shape there. And another kind of major difference, the drag chute back here, this area, it is redesigned and reshaped to be more effective on the new version. And like I said, there were several product improvements since they had the opportunity with the new version they took full advantage of. Compared to this on the PDS, it's actually a little bit shorter, but sticks out more. This is boxier, a little bit taller, and barely protrudes it off in the rear. And it is quite nice that Hobbymaster took the time to make these little changes to the model. And there are a few small little detail differences besides. But at least you can tell they didn't just do a straight repaint and call it a day. Yeah. And of course our PDS. So what about service and how things changed? And what about the MiG-31, an aircraft that Hobbymaster definitely should do? So here we have the Libyan model of the PD. And that was one of the first export customers. 96 total Foxbats were sent, both PD and RB variants. This would be between the very late 70s and the early 80s. And they would fly them. They would be in active service during 1981 and later on during territorial water disputes with the USA, like the Gulf of Sidra affair. And they would fly them for a while, but most were grounded due to lack of spare parts, poor maintenance, yada yada. In fact, during the 2011 Civil War there, really no Foxbats were in flyable condition, although some were nominally refurbished and put back into service in 2015. Another user around the same time frame was Syria, and actually one of the earliest air-to-air engagements, really the first time the F-15 went up against the MiG-25, was on February 13, 1981, when the Israelis, because of course Israelis, used kind of a bait operation to get a couple of Syrian MiG-25s to come out. They actually used F-4s to get them out, and then the F-15s would pounce on them, and this resulted in one being shot down, one running away. And in July, another Syrian MiG-25 would be shot down by another Israeli F-15. In fact, I have a model of one of the Israeli F-15s that did that. So that's kind of neat. And the Foxbat would have a long service in Syria. In fact, some were still flying in 2014 during the Civil War, although, of course, aging out. This model here is from the Iraqi Air Force, another major user. In the 1980s, the Iraqis flew many missions, many sorties, with the Foxbat in their war with Iran. And in fact, all of the Foxbat's air-to-air victories were with the Iraqi Air Force. They had a pretty good record. They shot down at least 12, maybe 15 aircraft during the 80s. 3 Iraqi Foxbats were lost, but 2, maybe even only 1, was to another aircraft. The others were to ground fire. So yeah, a good record there, all things considered. And it would continue into the Gulf War. The Iraqis would fly them in 1991, January. And actually, this model here is from January 17, when an Iraqi MiG-25 PDS here would shoot down an American FA-18 Hornet, which was pretty extraordinary. It was, I think, the only air-to-air victory of that nature during the whole war. And these would fight the F-15, and again, a couple were shot down by them, but others successfully ran away. Now, on January 30th, it's alleged that another Iraqi Foxbat damaged an F-15C, but this is debatable. So it's possible there was another hit, and if so, this would be the only time the 25 kind of got the better of a 15. So they definitely saw some foreign service, but this was never intended as a major export. In fact, the whole Interceptor thing meant it was a pretty limited role. Algeria also flew it. In fact, it was really the last nation to fly it. Interestingly, India purchased and flew in secret several MiG-25 RB reconnaissance variants over Pakistan. Even though they did this for about 2 decades, they kept it very much on the DL. They did not want this getting out. They finally kind of had to admit to it in the late 90s, and that led to its retirement in 2006. That's kind of where the future was. For example, Russia would continue to fly the updated version in the 1980s. They would use it to try to intercept the SR-71, but even the updated version couldn't quite manage it. The MiG-25 with 4 missiles had a ceiling of a little under 65,000 feet. With only 2 missiles, this could go up to nearly 80,000 feet. And if you had a stripped down plane with no weapons and kind of configured, well, it set altitude records as high as 115,000 feet. But of course, it got there. It couldn't do much. It's just what it is. So they would fly them for reconnaissance and whatnot. And then with the disillusionment of the USSR in 1991, 79 would be transferred to Ukraine as part of the breakup. And they would fly them for about a decade, but eventually, due to lack of spare parts and only, frankly, lack of need, they would slowly ground them. In the USSR, well, obviously, they would continue to fly them in the new Russian Federation, but they would slowly phase them out because of newer aircraft like the MiG-31 Foxhound. And I really hope someone does a model of the Foxhound one day, because I'd like to talk about it. It is definitely an improved version, and its own aircraft in its own right. But the MiG-25, it would leave VVS service in 2013. And really, it seems not really to be flying anywhere in Russia today. So let's have some final thoughts on Balinko and the whole thing. To be honest, even with the PD update, the Foxbat, well, its days were numbered. It was created for something that never really came to be. It was created to combat the B-70, the Valkyrie. Even the B-58 had relatively short service, and it really wasn't designed for aircraft like the B-1B, the B-2, or even really the B-52 as it were. It's kind of amazing that Russia found a role for it, but they did. In some ways, the reconnaissance variant really was more successful than the Interceptor variant. The PD was more of a stopgap measure. The production line on paper ended in 1984. However, really, orders for new machines ended around 1981, 1982, with the last couple of years just being building up machines from existing parts, especially for export customers like Iraq and Syria and so on. The Russian PVO, really, it had moved on. The MiG-31, eventually the Su-27P, and so forth. Certainly a relic of the Cold War, but that's not to discredit how impressive it was, especially for 1964 when the prototype first flew. But by 1984, we were well into the fourth generation of fighters, and this just could not keep up, nor did they really want to. The subsequent MiGs and Sukhois were just superior aircraft. That said, this was still the fastest and highest flying Russian aircraft, but by the 1980s, that's not what the military needed. It didn't need a fast, high-flying, low maneuverability aircraft. It needed a low-flying, maneuverable aircraft as an air superiority fighter early on, and then later the need changed even more to be a multi-role fighter-bomber. This is why you see the MiG-29 and the Su-27 kind of evolve into that. And this really just couldn't be that. Yeah, it could drop 500 kilogram bombs, but yeah, its weapons are pretty limited. It's good that they gave it the R-60 missiles for self-defense, because before it really had nothing. The R-40 was not designed for shooting down fighters, especially at low altitudes. It was to shoot down big bombers. But technology changed thanks to the newer aircraft like the B-1 and B-2, ICBMs, satellite type things, surveillance. It really kind of fell out of thing. As for Viktor Belenko, well, why did he do it? No one really knows. He's written, well, ghost-written, a autobiography, but it said that the air base he was stationed at near Vladivostok was frankly a shithole. And we're talking about it was a shithole even by Soviet standards. So it was bad. He was also married. He was 29, I believe, at the time. His wife seemed very discontent, was threatening to go back west to civilization, so he doesn't seem to have had a happy marriage. The Soviet Union at the time, while it was still over a decade from falling apart, the writing was already on the wall. You had a government that was claiming to be superior and provide workers paradise and be doing great, yet everyday citizens noticed life was stagnating, the economy was starting to decline, and you just couldn't trust the government propaganda. They didn't have their money where their mouth was. Doesn't sound at all familiar, does it, guys? So generally speaking, he was discontent. And so he gambled and flew to the West and was granted asylum. Now, in America, he became a citizen a few years later. He was an advisor to the U.S. government, the U.S. military on Soviet tactics and doctrine. He did bring over some documentation for both the MiG-25 and the very early MiG-31s. He even befriended Chuck Yeager and a few other, well-known names in their older age. He seemed to love being a cowboy. He even got married again and had a couple of kids in America. So his life was alright, if not spectacular. And of course, in Russia, he was considered a traitor. And frankly, rightfully so. What he did was against his oath and his uniform. Now, he might have had justified reasons. And of course, in the West, he was hailed as a hero, or at least a friend, and took a noble risk for asylum. But in Russia, he was reviled. And I think if an American pilot had fled with an F-15 around the same time period, we would have kind of felt much the same. So, that's the Cold War for you. Espionage and whatnot. One man's hero is another man's villain. Who's to say? But he was kind of a byproduct of a government that wasn't taking care of its citizens, especially its soldiers. And, again, the MiG-25, while a great aircraft for performance, was a bit of a bluff. And when he did his thing, it ended that bluff. Luckily, Russia had plenty of other aircraft, the MiG-23, the Su-27, the MiG-29 later. So, hey. But they only built about 1,200 of these, including the fighter bomber version. Well, I should say the reconnaissance bomber version, sorry. And a few two-seaters and what have you. So it wasn't exactly what they were hanging their hat on, which is a shame because really it took a decade to get the bugs worked out and get it into service, and then it wasn't even in production for a decade after that. But they can't all be winners, and it still set a lot of records. I believe it made nearly 24 records, several of which lasted into the 21st century, and a few might even still stand to this day. Despite everything else, just in terms of performance, it was a fucking hot rod. I mean, exceeding Mach 3, climbing well over 100,000 feet, dependable, durable, carrying 4 of the largest and most long-range missiles for the day and time, having one of the most powerful and jam-resistant, I guess you would say, or cutting through jamming. Now I'm thinking of Spaceballs. They're jamming us. I wish I could add little clips here. I'd throw it in right now. Mel Brooks. But anyway, yeah, I mean, I'm not trying to degrade it. And really, the only thing the West had that was similar was the SR-71 Blackbird, which I've said in previous videos had its own issues. And also keep in mind, they built 1,200 of these. America built 30 some odd SR-71 Blackbirds at a much higher cost. Being Soviet, well, it was cheaper. Give it that. And the construction used in the fuselage, with the stainless steel and the welding and the fixtures they developed for it, it was impressive technology, different from the West. Even its use of vacuum tubes, while the Westerners kind of derided it, it was something. I mean, it was a interesting answer to a problem. They also developed very high-temperature, heat-resistant plexiglass for the cockpit. Notice how small the cockpit is and how large the intakes are. God, they're huge engines. That almost seems to be kind of something you see a lot with Soviet planes. Like the MiG-23 is also a huge engine with a little bit of plane wrapped around it. That's MiG for you. And the MiG-21 is the same way. It's kind of why I like the MiG design. And this is one of the largest MiG aircraft, if you think about it. Most of their planes are very small and lightweight and economical. This is one of their biggest, baddest projects. And again, the Iraqis showed that it could be an air fighter. It was never intended to be that. But the Russians, well, they mostly used it in its reconnaissance version. It gave the Israelis headaches in the early 70s. It was also a NAD-5 for the Iranians before the overthrow of the Shah. The Russians overflew their airspace to see what they were up to, especially when they were working on the F-14 stuff. And again, it would fly over Swedish airspace and whatnot, doing its thing. As far as I know, China never flew this, but I could be wrong. But I don't remember any Chinese version. It just doesn't seem like it ever made it to the east, to the Asiatic theaters. It was mostly Russia, a handful of Eastern European states, and namely the Middle East and North Africa. That said, even though I know it's far from perfect and has some serious detractions, God, it's just one of my favorite Russian aircraft. And for a time, I was really happy with just having these two. I bought this one first because I thought it was neat that it came with the R-60 missiles. And then, mostly just because of the history, I thought the Iraqi version was neat, and I found it on sale. And like I said, I really wanted this one because of the Balinko story and the fact that it's a true P, not a PD. But prices were way too high until Pete's cut me a discount. He's one of the few places that still has this model left in stock, so, if you want one, it is what it is. And I'm happy to report that they did at least change a few things up so that it's different from the other ones. They put some care into it, which Hobby Master often does. I'm just wondering, since they changed some aspects, that the tooling is just too altered to ever go back to making a pure P version. It's kind of how models can be sometimes. And I do think it's neat that they include both types of seeker heads on the missiles. They don't give you 4 of the same missiles. They literally do give you 2 and 2. One of them has a narrow pointed tip. One of them has a fatter rounded tip. So even the details there. And the landing gear, they come in neat little plug-ins. And they do come with the fuel tank, which is neat. I wish they would do a MiG-25RB. I think that'd be special. Or even better yet, like I said, a MiG-31 Foxhound. But, we get what we get, right, folks? But since I had this one to show you and a little bit more information, I'm not going to pass up an opportunity to talk about one of my favorites. But the truth is, I kind of like all MiGs, I'm not going to lie. They're all cool. I like the MiG-23. Swing wing is kind of neat. The MiG-29 is a classic. And the MiG-21, what can you say? Anyway, guys, I appreciate you tuning in to this addendum episode. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe, and all that great stuff. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon next time.